So before we conclude all of that here, and you can always dive into the GitHub repository to learn more, let me show you one super important feature of Next.js. Let's go back to the index.js file in the pages folder, so our main page here. And let's turn this from a functional into a class-based component by naming this class index page maybe, exporting this as a default. Let's then therefore also export component from React because we still, as always, need to extend component here. And there we have a render method. So this is all just the same where we return some JSX, and the JSX of course is the JSX I returned before. Let's get rid of that stuff down there, quickly reformat, and we're good to go. Everything should still work as before. Now we're using a class-based component, and that's one thing I wanted to show you. I also want to show you a special lifecycle hook you can use though. And unlike the React lifecycle hooks, that lifecycle hook would even be available in functional components. I'll show you how to use it there too, but let's start in the class-based one. It's called getInitialProps, and it'll receive an argument which describes the context of your application. Let's simply log context to see what's inside of that and when this gets called. Now, to see what's inside of getThat, we need to change that because it's not a normal lifecycle method like the other ones. Instead, it's a static method, which means it can be called without the component being instantiated yet. And it's an asynchronous method, which means it doesn't resolve, it doesn't return something instantly. Now let's save this and wait for compilation, and let's reload the page then. Now we see that it should resolve to an object. So let's fine tune it, and let's make sure we actually return an object. It can be empty though. And now with that, let's reload the page. And we don't see anything here. We don't even see a console log. We can see something in the console though, in the console here where we ran npm run dev, because this code actually is executed on the server first. It will only be executed on the child if you navigate it there within the app, so by clicking a link for example. If you navigate it there by typing the URL and hitting enter or refresh, it executes on the server. That's the special thing about this lifecycle method. It executes either on the server or the client, and you can use it to initialize your app before it loads. So on the server, for example, in getInitialProps, you could fetch data from a database and then pre-populate the props this page component will receive with props of your choice. For example, here we could hardcode an app name prop, which is a super app, which of course here isn't fetched from some database, but you could easily do that. Since it's an async method, you can use the await keyword in here to await for a promise to resolve, and you would typically have a promise or something like that if you are reaching out to a web server, for example with Axios. Now if you don't want to use async here, what you can also do is you can still use the normal static method like this, in case you don't know that async await syntax. And then what you would do here is you would create a promise or use a package like Axios, which does something that returns a promise. Here I'll create one manually with the new promise keyword. And there, if you create it manually on your own, you would always pass a function which receives resolve and reject, two functions that can execute. If that's all new to you, I recommend refreshing the promise knowledge in general, as this is an important JavaScript feature. In a promise, you typically execute async code, and again, oftentimes you don't write promises on your own, but you use some package which wraps some async action like reaching out to a server in a promise. Axios, which we used in this course, does that, for example. So here in that async action, like set timeout to fake the reaching out to a server, you would then call resolve and return your data, like the name of the app, super app. And then what you can do, or let's name it app name here too. What you can do is you can listen to that promise with the then keyword and pass a function to then, which will be executed as soon as the promise resolved. Now this then part is what we leave out here. Instead here, we simply return the entire promise in our getInitialProps method. And Next.js will take care about listening to its result and then pre-populate our props once the result is there and only render the page once the result is there. So now here in our page, we could say the main page off and then render this props app name, and we know that this will be populated because we pre-populate the props here in our getInitialProps function. If we now save this file here and we reload this page, you see it takes a bit longer to load because it needs to wait for this second here we specified on set timeout, but then it actually displays super app here because it did pre-populate our props. So getInitialProps, super important, working together with promises, either promises written by you or returned by third-party packages. It'll wait for them to resolve and pre-populate your props. Now let's dive into that context we get here. We print it here with console log and we can inspect it here on the server since we loaded the page by simply refreshing it. Now it's quite hard to read that here because we see all the nested properties and so on too. So let's get rid of that and instead have a look at the official docs of Next.js. There, if we go to the getInitialProps part, which is about fetching data and the component lifecycle, we see that the context has the path name of the page we loaded, so what's after the slash, any query params we might have, and important, on the server only though, the request and response object. So basically the same you would get in an Express.js environment. This allows you to really get all the information of the request that reached the page. You might not need that, but there are also some use cases where this can be really helpful as it allows you to analyze what exactly the user requested and so on. So here we're not taking advantage of the incoming context data. We could do so though, of course. We're nonetheless using this to initialize our props, which is an important function of this method. It's probably the reason why it's called getInitialProps. Now, how do we use this in a functional component? This is possible. You can see how it works on the official documentation too. You simply create your constant and then add this, as it is a static method, to that constant after you created it. A function, which a functional component of course is in the end, allows you to add something to it inside of that function. A function, which this constant here in the end is, and which our constant here also is just a JavaScript object, so we can add static methods to it. So I can't just say off index page getInitialProps, and therefore I define this method, and Next.js will only call it if it is defined, otherwise it will just skip it. And then we define it just as we did in the other file. So there I can now also set up my promise here and then return it and set getInitialProps equal to an arrow function where I would receive context passed in automatically by Next.js and then create my promise and return it. And here we can say app name super app off to really see that something's different. And here we could output this in our JSX code, of course, too, app name. If we now save this, we see that if we reload our main page, not /off, it of course still works. But if I go to off, it takes a second because it needed to resolve that. And then it just fails because I forgot to pass props into that functional component. We have to do that, of course. So let's try this again. Let's go back to the main page first. And then let's click on off and wait that second. And then we go there and also see that populated. So getInitialProps, super useful lifecycle, which works in both functional and class-based components, and which allows you to initialize your props before the page is actually loaded.